Good afternoon. I'm very excited to be here today. I am Karimah Richardson, the Associate Curator of Archaeology and Osteology here at the Autry Museum of the American West. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge the traditional caretakers of the land that we are on, the Tongva Gabrielino people. I'd also like to thank the Autry sponsors, generous donors for making this program happen. Super excited. I'm honored, along with our Board of Trustees, to welcome you to the Autry Artists Salon on Archaeology Stewardship. Today, joining me is Dr. Wendy Teeter, Senior Curator of Archaeology at the UCLA Fowler Museum and Repatriation Coordinator. She is a Co-Principal Investigator, Co-director on multiple projects and committees and collaborations with UCLA faculty and staff and indigenous communities. I welcome her today to join us. She's a friend, a colleague, a mentor, and the best person to start off this archaeology stewardship series. So there's a Q&A box at the end. At the end, we will answer any questions, comments that you think about as we kind of lead you through what I call kind of a history of archaeology within Los Angeles. But let's get started. I want to introduce Wendy, and she's going to give you a little introduction into herself.
Thanks for having me, Karimah. And I'm really delighted to be here. And it's great that we can sort of have this conversation. We've obviously been working together for such a long time. So it kind of brings us full circle and kind of talking about how the Autry and the Fowler Museum kind of come together. So I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, we were really excited as we kind of went down memory lane of our colleagues, our predecessors actually, who have kind of founded the museum collections that both you and I curate, and how we are now at this junction where we're still kind of curating and collaborating with the same institution. So it'll be nice to share that with our visitors, who some are not even sure why museums have archaeology collections. Some know exactly why museums have archaeology collections. They've even researched the collections, or they've asked for the collections to be returned. So we have a variety of understanding that, I hope with our topic goals, we're able to kind of paint a picture for our guests. So let's get started. So in thinking about all of the visitors and students and varying questions that both of us have received over the years about why curating an archaeology collection at a museum is quite an ordeal, I put together kind of some thoughts, especially as it pertains to both of our institutions. So first, we're going to kind of talk generally. Tell us about the UCLA's archaeology collection, how it was created, and then we'll compare it to the Southwest Museum collection and how it was created. We'll talk about these crossover collections, these connections between institutions, which will lead us to kind of our current day phenomena of the curation crisis. And then the missing voices, the communities that these collections represent. And then what we kind of think the future, where these collections are headed. So let's begin. So Wendy, why don't you tell us a little bit about how the archaeology collections at UCLA came to be?
Thanks, Karimah. And I do want to acknowledge I'm actually talking to you right now from Tampa, which is Seminole Aboriginal territory. And behind me is Pimu, Catalina Island, where both of us spend our time with Tiat Society of the Gabrielino Tongva people. And so we'll certainly get into that later on. But I just wanted to do that little brief acknowledgement. And to also say, like, part of the reason why we're really able to dive into this talk is because of the obligations under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. So when we talk about the history of UCLA in collecting, or the Southwest, we're really talking about collections that were donated by different people, different advocates, different lay people who found collections in their yard or backyard, or when they were on a trip, they amass this material of archaeological material, and then they donate it to a university. And our founding was by Ralph Beals in 1940, who was an anthropologist, a cultural anthropologist mostly. And then he brought in George Brainard, who was a ceramicist who worked both in the Southwest and in Mesoamerica. And it's from those two that we end up sort of the creating of our collections, which was within the anthropology department. So he not only founded it, but then sort of created this four-field approach and bringing in material culture and cultural ethnography from different indigenous communities from around the world. The collection stayed within anthropology until around 1969. And it was the formation of the Institute of Arts and Crafts that was the sort of foundation that became the Cultural History Museum at UCLA. And the ethnographic materials in the 1960s switched over to this new founder. And then the anthropology department in 1969 followed that with the archaeology collections.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is we also have, as we'll talk about later, a connection to Brainard, and our founding with Charles F. Lummis, who was a part of the larger Archaeological Institute of America, wanted to start focusing on the Southwest specifically, and kind of broke off, not severed, but just started another subdivision of the Society of Southwest Archaeology, and then began to kind of narrow focus of wanting to kind of collect both ethnographic and archaeology materials of first the Southwest, the California, Great Basin, and just kind of grew into an indigenous kind of collecting practice, which is why the institution has the second largest collection of Native objects in the nation. But a large part of that is archaeology, and we kind of span the eras of different types of collecting. So like you said, we have the donated, the gifted, the found in my garden or my backyard, or the amateurs, those inspired by what's kind of going on in the East Coast, where it's starting to get a little bit more systemic and practice. And by the time we hire Mark Raymond Harrington as the museum curator for 40 years, the practice then shifts and changes. And that's where we see all of these nice kind of interconnections between the institutions. But yes, it very much started as kind of a labor of love and interest, and then kind of built from there.
Well, it is kind of, and it's kind of interesting too, because while the museum, if we think of, the sort of Indiana Jones idea and concept, right, then you think about this, this sort of professor that's going from a museum to an institution and teaching classes. And that was actually the case. So we have sort of Ralph Beals and George Brainard being promised this sort of museum position, right, to make it more legitimate, a museum space to show these expeditions and academic work that they were involved with. So it was very much a tied situation, right? And that kind of leads us into these conversations where we're just constantly going, do you have that?
Yes.
I have that.
Yes, let's talk about the crossover collection. Let's see the next slide. And it is out of me entering 10 years ago, the Curator of Archaeology position, trying to prepare the collection to move to its new resting home at the Autry's Resources Center, trying to put back expeditions in the order that they came in the 20s and 30s and the 40s, and saying, oh, I think this person is UCLA. Oh, wait, I think this person is USC. So, I mean, for those who are new to our institution and don't know a large history about the archaeology collection, the Southwest Museum Collection and the Autry, they all merged in 2003. So we're referring to a large institutional collection. The museum started in 1907 with Lummis kind of trekking across the US, make his home in Los Angeles. Southwest Museum was the first museum of Los Angeles. In this conversation, a couple of days ago, we discovered that kind of all roads lead back to the Southwest Museum in some form or fashion, whether it's the anthropologists or the archaeologists. At one time, everyone was trying to publish in the master key, or like you said, they had these joint positions where I want to be at this institution, but I want access to the Southwest Museum collection. So what we discovered is we have these connections that are on every level. So the volunteer that works not only for the Southwest Museum, volunteers at the Natural History, also volunteers at UCLA, or is a student at UCLA. And vice versa, the professor who also has the research space at the Southwest Museum, who used to be the curator at Natural History Museum. Next slide, please. So it's been really interesting kind of unraveling these pieces and trying to understand like why we have certain collections and why we don't, or why we're constantly on the phone with each other trying to understand who has what end of what collection.
Right, and especially when you think about someone like George Brainard, who's considered one of the fathers of ceramics in Mesoamerica and the Southwest, he needed access to vast amounts of ceramics, and he was constantly going into the field and trying to figure it out. So it makes sense that there would be these ties to these large collections, and it was definitely within Los Angeles that we see so many people coming together. And then it extends to the Smithsonian, and it's extending the tentacles to Yale and all of these, Harvard and so forth. But there's such a powerhouse going on here. USC had a much bigger archaeology department with William Wallace, and they had those ties into the Natural History Museum. So, you know, and then that goes back to the Southwest Museum, which goes back.
Right, exactly. Because a lot of our early kind of 2030s Edwin Walker projects, every time I open a manuscript or a new report in the master key, it says used USC students. Because you kind of, after a while, kind of wonder, well, where are they getting all of the labor for all of these projects in which we have mass amount of shelves and boxes of these heavy collections? So you want to know, like, what's the manpower? And it was these students from all of these surrounding institutions.
Absolutely, and doing the work that both of us are doing, it becomes so imperative to actually speak to as many of these early folks as possible.
Yes.
And it's been amazing, or it was amazing to be able to talk to like someone like Charles Rozier, who was a kid in Culver City when he started to volunteer at the Southwest Museum in the 1930s and 1940s, and then became a UCLA undergraduate, and he went there all the way through his PhD, but was still working for the Southwest Museum. And then becomes eventually, after a stint at the Nevada State Museum, he becomes the curator at the Natural History Museum. And still is doing work between all of our institutions.
Antelope Valley Museum as well. And he had connections to CSUN. So, I mean, Charles Rozier alone is like the perfect example of these kind of crossover of institutions. And he didn't really leave his hat at any particular door. He said, yes, I'm here at UCLA, but I'm representing Southwest Museum, and I'm about to cross over town to go swing by Natural History. So when we have these moments where we're now coming behind Charles Rozier and his predecessors, it's like, well, why do you have half of the collection and I have half? Well, he felt that day that he felt it was best at your facility, and he thought the rest of it belonged at the Southwest Museum.
And you know, it's I know both of us have talked about it and we didn't really highlight it, but it is within these institutions and these connections that you see a big thriving female archaeologist group of people, right? So from Bertha Parker, who's Native American and is doing archaeology, to Dee Simpson and you know, so many people who blaze those, like that blaze these trails, and they are doing so within these four institutions that is very white male dominated, but at the same time leaves a lot of space for women to actually go out and run their own projects. And Ruth Dee Simpson is actually then also a curator as well at the Natural History Museum.
Right. And I think that's what makes so there's these buildup of independent institutions having their own academic, so there's the museum institutions with these curators who have their own academic institution as support. And then you enter the contract archaeology era, where development around the Southwest Museum, around natural history, around UCLA starts to increase at a rate that the Southwest Museum couldn't keep up. And so within their walls, they started a subdivision called the Archaeological Survey Association, because they were concerned about the rate of development. And, you know, by my mind, kind of founded like some of the earlier CRM companies, and ASA tapped into all of those institutions and the state schools to kind of continue this effort of producing well-trained archaeologists back into the field from like the same kind of very incestuous in-house relationship, but became the forefront, became a model, I would say, for how these museum collections started to operate within like a certain set of institutions, and then modeled. I mean, even Hasso von Wenning, who was a research associate, who had a degree from UCLA, who had a degree from USC, ends up working for not only the Southwest Museum, but the Bowers. So now we're going into Orange County, and he also worked for San Diego Museum of Man. So like the network, like I say, all roads somehow touch the museum, the Southwest Museum. But, you know, all joking aside, we have found a lot of different trails and paths that we like to follow that lead us to UC Berkeley or lead us to San Diego Museum of Man. And in some of the earlier archaeologists' case at the Southwest Museum start on the East Coast, because that's where they're beginning to get formally trained and to kind of work their way to the West. And so kind of going back to what you were talking about earlier, like the why of these museum collections, because for a long time, a lot of collectors just kept them in their house. But as museums started to get more savvy, wanted to put things on display, within the first museum of Los Angeles, it was all about the large diagnostic pieces. So it was about collecting objects so you could put them on display. And for the Southwest Museum, like if we take the era of Mark Raymond Harrington alone, he was museum curator for 40 years. And he did a lot of field projects every single season, minimum 100 sites on an expedition. So you have this era of kind of coming in and out, in and out, in and out. And then he assigns Edwin Walker to deal with all of the salvage archaeology projects that are coming from contract archaeology. And so the museum starts to fill up.
And really that's what we're talking about, that we're changing from this sort of era of going out in large expeditions and creating these sort of massive collections that are generally surface surveyed. So that means that they're mostly just picking things up and then comparing them to each other. It's not necessarily like a unit excavation where you have rigorous science that's being hypo-deductive modeling that's being asked of the material. It's really more about trying to get sort of broad surveys, broad understandings of culture. And really, this is where the Southwest and UCLA start to sort of coalesce, right, with the Rainbow Bridge Monument Valley expedition from the late 1920s, right? And that really is touching thousands of sites, but like 5 or 6 pots and maybe some remains and maybe some jewelry. And so you get sort of this idea that if you just have a few things, that you're going to know the culture. You don't need to worry about change in culture. You don't need to worry about people moving around. It's literally like 5 shirts will tell me everything that I need to know about this site.
Right.
Right. And so we end up with these sort of vast collections. And then in the 1960s and 70s, we start seeing much more rigorous sort of science and trying to be a little more knowledgeable, right? Systematic. And so then you need a lot more, right? Because then you have to dig in units and sort of try to test your hypothesis. And you again get massive sort of collections. So there was a question that David asked about some of the strengths in the collections. And I would say in some ways it's kind of interesting because you can almost, between either the Southwest Museum or the Autry and the Fowler, you can probably find remains, cultural remains, not necessarily human remains, but cultural remains from almost every important culture in the entire world, right? It really comes from this sort of wonder cabinet style of museum building. But the problem is that you don't have the depth. You don't necessarily know where it comes from because it doesn't have this real context in sort of time and space. It's just sort of a representation of it. And so that's what you see starting to happen in the 1970s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would say to kind of tag on to that, the strength then, because of where we're situated, is a focus, right, on California materials, Los Angeles materials, and then the coast, the islands, especially given the institutions that we just mentioned, there becomes a kind of a focus on coastal and island archaeology. But with that being said, both of our collections have California, we have Great Basin, we have a heavy Southwest, we have Mesoamerican collections because of people like Hassel van Wenning who are going to both institutions, and that was his focus. And then we were on a joint expedition, like you mentioned, the Rainbow Bridge. So we have a plethora of Southwest material of over 1,500 sites in which they're collecting diagnostic pots and the sherds to make a type collection. So I think what happened is we became maybe a center. What do you think? A hub of collections that could be used for teaching, for research. We know several colleagues who have used both of our collections for their master's thesis or their dissertation.
Absolutely. And you can see within, these are great examples because what you end up having is these sort of really large amounts of items that you then have to care for, right? So it looks great if you're the one needing the material to do your research. What becomes more troublesome is if you're the one who has to find space and you get these boxes of material that's coming out of the field. They're not necessarily processed. You need a lot of assistance to sort of go through it. And this is where the UCLA and USC come into being, because they provide the student labor to go through all those boxes and do master's theses with and start to answer those sort of questions. So this system only works as long as you have a never-ending stream of graduate students, Karimah, to answer those questions. Because when you're faculty, then you're the one that's having to teach and you're having to do all of this sort of getting money, and your focus shifts from being able to spend a lot of time, unless you have it built in to your job, a lot of time with the collections. Right. So right, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was gonna say, so it's this like, as curators, this constant kind of, we're stewarding in perpetuity. And so those kind of questions are constantly coming up as we talk on the conference level at committees at either California or even nationally. We're not the only institutions are talking about, well, how are we the best stewards that we can be for these collections, which leads us right to the curation crisis and the missing voices, right? That's like the elephant in the room. Who represents these communities of the collections that we house?
So we're really talking about, by the time we're getting into not only the 70s and the hypo-deductive modeling of science, where you have people doing rigorous testing, they're going out and producing massive amounts of data, both ethnographically and archaeologically, to try to answer sort of deep questions in time and space. So the more you go down, right, the older the material, the farther you go back. So all of this material is being produced, but we're inundated. So the backlog of taking care of this material becomes so extreme that you start having, well, for two reasons. One, because they were already doing the work, but two, you have the start of sort of compliance. There's a recognition that this is the cultural patrimony of the United States and of the past, and that we need to start taking care of these places. So we have compliance law, and this compliance law requires curation of collections that are created during development projects and during renovations and all sorts of things. So you end up with a lot of material, right?
Right.
And they need a place to go.
Right. And then it's kind of it's nuanced, right? So there is the private company who has their own thoughts and expectations on what it means to, house and curate. And then there's the federal collections, federal agencies who have no choice but to follow the letter of the law and find a place for these collections if they are going to be recovered out of the ground. We can talk a little bit later about the ethics and the trends towards not collecting as much, but it's because of these new environmental policies, both for and California is not the only state that has these laws in which if materials are dug up, they have to have a plan and they have to work with the surrounding communities, sometimes the museums, to find a safe place that meets 36 CFR 79. And that's its own, that's probably series number 3.
Just want to say, like, the main issue when we're talking about sort of compliance work is that it's a shift again. Remember, we're talking about how we have academics and they're doing work, right? And so they have students and they're going back and they're producing research questions and collections that are being looked at. And then eventually they come into the museum. The museum has to take care of them in perpetuity. In perpetuity. But with compliance work, you start having these firms that are created by archaeologists that are doing it for profit.
Right.
And then time is money, literally time is money. So they are negotiating a rate and saying, okay, I'm going to look at this site that you're going to impact with your dam, say, that's going to flood this area. And there are 17 sites that we know about. So we're going to try to salvage as much information about them and then bring them in. So they come into the museum, they came into UCLA, and nobody really has looked at them beyond saying there was 17 sherds, there was 13 groundstone pieces, and that's it. There's no graduate student work. There's no really depth involved of how it relates in this sort of big picture.
Right.
That compliance work creates the crisis, right? Because
Right.
we end up having an overwhelming amount of material because as that dam project that's going on in the Central Valley is going on in 3 other parts at the same time. And it's going on, they're trying to put in a housing development, or they're putting in Highway 101. UCLA was the person responsible for all the archaeological mitigation for the creation of Highway 101, for the
Right.
creation of PCH.
Right.
So you have these, think about those roads and how many village sites that they probably impacted. And that gives you some idea of how much material we're talking about. But again, without the graduate students
Right.
that are going to look at them. So they
Right.
just sit on the shelves in their boxes.
I was going to say, yeah, I mean, I think as I was telling you earlier about coming into this position to work on rehousing the collection to move them to the new Autry Resources Center, this is kind of the information that I started to uncover, where you have all of these expeditions, ASA in particular, who are working on projects like the highway project that you mentioned. And so we're kind of nicely situated at a moment where we have an opportunity to go back to put things back on the shelves and kind of take our time. And that's one thing about the Resources Center that is nice, is that we have this ability to kind of take our time to piece back the players, piece back the collections, piece back the communities that have either been wrongly labeled, mislabeled, not labeled, to give all of the players, all of the stakeholders, which is probably a better word, a voice back at the table to kind of help shed light and share the knowledge of these collections, which I think leads to who's missing, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, like we had the Northridge earthquake, and that kind of created an unstable environment in which the UCLA collections were in. And so I became curator in 1997 after being hired as a graduate student who knew osteology. So my job was to go through all of the animal bone looking for human, which because of NAGPRA. So it was 1990, we have this sort of this federal law that says that you have to have a minimal standard, right? And so what you find, like at UCLA, when I first started, we were in the sub basement, not the basement. We were in the sub basement, but sprinklers were hitting the wall and it was literally leaking through and then coming into the floor. And so collections were on old wooden trays, and you would take them out and get all sorts of like splinters, but they were just kind of like shaking, and then they would fall into the sort of mud that was on the floor. And it was really these less than ideal conditions, right? And so the problem became that you were removing, there was no time or investment by anyone in these sort of archaeological materials, because museums like pretty things, right? We all want to go to an exhibition, we want to look at the prettiest. So those pretty things were the things that would end up on display. And then all of the thousands of pottery shards that were not pretty were left in the back and left in their original materials. And there was no money, no one cared to actually try to take care of it, which is really the bulk of this conversation we're having, is that it's not until 1990 that you get this investment in because of federal law into, one, the upkeep and care, what do you have? And then two, the social movement of the 1960s, where Native Americans are trying to get their ancestors off a display, that takes until 1990 for them to finally get a law that says, we want our ancestors off display. We want the museums to tell us what you have in terms of Native American remains, which are, again, mostly from archaeological endeavors, right?
Yeah.
So that accountability becomes the first opportunity that the museum has to provide money, right? And so I am grateful, because it is NAGPRA and the Northridge earthquake that provides the opportunity for demanding, and it was the American Indian Studies Graduate Students Association and our Tongva and Waneño, Ahashiman and Tatavian partners who demanded that their cultural material be taken care of in a better way. So it wasn't the museum director, it wasn't anthropology students, it wasn't an anthropology professor. It was literally the ground, it was the ground community that demanded that they were involved with NAGPRA, that there was money set aside for it. And we were able to do what we were doing, including pay me as a graduate student to go through all of the bones.
Yeah, and that. No, but I think it was not a chain reaction, but as we keep talking about, the repeat of institutional players, right, to participate, I think in that wave, then, our colleagues at UC Santa Barbara sent Phil Walker down to begin to look at all of these collections, including the Southwest Museum, to try to better associate who was within the collection. We've learned so much since the 90s. We've learned so much in the last 10 years since I've been working on the collection about who's represented. We have great relationships, especially with our local community, the Gabrielino Tongva, and they now have an MOU with the Autry Museum to kind of assist us in interpretation with museums. So it goes beyond, it starts with the interest in the collections. It starts with how, especially in their territory, the museum spent a lot of effort doing either kind of piecemeal collection or systematic in some cases, or salvage in some cases, where they put up a reservoir. So what's nice is that this history helps inform. And so we're able to kind of pull, when we're asked the question, well, why do you have this? Or why was this collected this way compared to, this process? And we can share the institutional knowledge that we're learning from each other in the collections.
Absolutely. And it really, I am certainly grateful for the people that have been willing, that came before me, and certainly willing to talk to us. So like, we spent hours recording Charles Rozier about his time at all of these institutions, and being able to sort of ask why, or Keith Johnson. So here's an example for you all. That's probably not a great example, but it is a really great example. We work on Catalina Island, and Cindy Autry, who's the director of the TIA Society and is Tongva, her and I are sitting at the Society for California Archaeology meetings, talking about what happened to all of the ancestors that were removed by Ralph Glidden, who was a looter. We had no idea where it went. We knew that he had a museum made of human remains. So what happened to those collections? They were no place. There were about 200 cranium and 60 pelvis, which did not represent what we were seeing. And so we've been, trying to track it down. So we're sitting there at this cafe having this conversation, and Keith Johnson walks by. And of course, I've always talked to him about what his time was like in the 1950s before he became a professor at Cal State Chico. So he's telling me about his time on the island and all these places. And he goes, "Hey guys, what are you guys talking about?" And we're like, "Oh, we're just trying to figure out, what happened to these remains." And he goes, "Oh, well, that's interesting because I was the one who removed them." And we were responsible. UCLA, Clem Meehan, who was a professor at UCLA, was responsible for dismantling this old museum on Catalina, and then salvaging what was deemed as being important. And at that time, the cranium, we're supposed to tell you age and sex and a lot of things about the person. The pelvis tells you about sort of gender, biological sex, and the femur tells you the height, right? So there were reasons about what materials were kept. And then he said, because they were literally nailed to the wall or epoxied, they were destroyed by removing. So the rest of the material was dumped at sea.
Oh, wow.
We would never have known that if
Right.
Keith Johnson had not disclosed that information in that moment. So, we kind of talk about, and there's been a lot of like pushback on Native American communities and indigenous communities that they're so oral history centric.
Right.
And we realize that we are so beholden. And
Yes.
we love when we're able to talk to our predecessors and
Yes.
ask them these sort of silly questions like, "And why did you, put this
Right.
collection in here? And what does HRS mean?" And
Yes.
these sort of weird things. And they're the only ones who can tell us the oral tradition of our museums.
Exactly.
But George Crichman is so important, right?
Yes. And he's 97, 98 now. And it's been a pleasure to have a couple of conversations with him, or even Charles Rozier. And I'd ask him one or two questions. Who both of George Crichman, for our viewers, George Crichman and Charles Rozier were the former curators of archaeology before me. So we have these two 98-year-olds, and then 10 years later, there's me. And they were involved in so much that even if I had a question, it kind of like veered into another direction, and I just write a bunch of notes to like fill in the gaps and learn so much about our collection. But this is why I wanted us to start the series with this conversation, because it's about the networks, the connections between institutions, on why we have the collections we have and how we're working collectively. It's not just the Autry thing, it's not just the Fowler Museum thing. We're working collectively to try to kind of figure out the best way to be stewards of these archaeology collections. Even today, we are still continuing in our predecessors' footsteps. UCLA, the Autry Southwest Museum. We work collaboratively with Lynn Dodd at USC. We work collaboratively with Amy Gussick at Natural History Museum. So you have the same 4 core institutions still working together, still brainstorming, still asking questions. Do you have that collection? Do I have that collection? I mean, it continues. And of course, it's a great shift because we're all women from, the heavy male-dominated, I had to say it, sorry. I represent a unique situation within my field, so I was gonna mention it a little bit. But it's nice to talk about, and we have a lot of respect for the predecessors who came before us. So we don't ever want to seem like we're the newbies coming in with a shift in mindset or direction. We may have a shift in mindset, but we are appreciative of the work that was done before us. And I'm getting the signal that it's almost time. We could talk
Yeah,
about—
do you want to put the final slide up?
Yes,
And
let's
yeah,
talk about some future.
just really quickly, and then we'll go back to the questions. I just want to point out that that with Desiree Martinez, who's the third in our Catalina Island Archaeology Project, who is Tongvad, that we have really talked about, especially those ancestral remains that came from Catalina, and that it did take this investigation and sort of, it wasn't just a knee-jerk reaction of, oh, give the bones back kind of thing. It really takes a lot of time and effort. This is very serious work in trying to figure out the history of these traumatic events to Indigenous communities. So we take the time, and we're really grateful. So you can actually see an article that we wrote about that work, and then we can go, forward. I just want to point that out, that there's authorship for that. And then as Karimah said, there's still a lot of work. There's a lot of museums that are behind, and we know that. And it's really important 30 years later that really all of these ancestors should be home. UCLA, we've done that, but and you can find that out on Carrying Our Ancestors Home, which is a joint project that I have with Ms. Shauna Goman, and it involves tribal practitioner stories. So really what we're talking about is sort of shifting the gaze and differing those stories so that we're forefronting the indigenous perspectives and bringing them in. And with that diversity, you end up being able to talk about traditional care practices. Maybe there are items that are for males and should be sort of set aside as much as we can. We've been able to really shift and accommodate those models. And Karimah, you guys are living large there with the diversity and curatorship.
Yes, well, I was going to add that, kind of the buildup to going back in the past and understanding the institutional history of our archaeology collections is so we can collaborate and start to put more of these objects on display with the right interpretation from the communities that they represent. And the Autry is currently doing that. I'm currently working on the waterways exhibit, in which it's going to focus on the waterways of Los Angeles. So the Los Angeles River, the Santa Ana River, the San Gabriel River, and the channel and its connection between the islands and the coast. And we have the collections to support it. So I think in time, as we continue to kind of fill in the gaps between our institutions and figure out who has what collection, you will shift and you will see that start to unfold in these programs that Wendy was mentioning and the exhibits that are coming down the pike at the Autry. That will go beyond and represent the collection. So yes, we have a heavy California, but we do with Southwest, and we will just kind of continue to broaden and highlight what has been collected and the reasons why and the reasons why not it was collected. So I am getting definitely the signal that it's time for Q&A. So I want to first thank Wendy for engaging me in this conversation that we often have. We both sit on the curation committee for the Society of California Archaeology, and a lot of these conversations that we had today, or these topics that we talked about today, come up. And sometimes I feel like it's interesting to share with the visitors and share with outsiders of the profession to see if there are any takers out there to kind of help send students, lend support, lend voices, because there's constant development in the US that's not declining. The rate of archaeological material is still, like, the profession is still going to thrive and is still relevant, and museums have a part to play. So I want to thank everyone so much for attending the first of these series, where I get to engage with my colleagues and others in the field about archaeology stewardship. So I'm going to look through our questions.
Yeah, well, we've actually been answering them as we go. So
Yeah.
I've been trying to sort of weave them in as I've been keeping track. Um, and
Archaeology headed in the future, does it grow and morph?
yeah,
Absolutely. It's constantly growing and changing. We didn't talk about it in detail, but one of the solutions to the curation crisis is maybe a shift from the need of collecting objects. Maybe you just sketch them, maybe you just record them, maybe use technology to map them. There's so many different types of technology besides GPS, besides radar. I mean, to kind of map a site or some objects in situ where it doesn't necessarily have to come into the museum. And then if more professors encourage their students to go back into these museum collections, there may be less of a need to excavate more. So, I mean, the future is bright and it's interesting, and the students all have really great ideas about how to move the field forward. It's more collaborative now than it's ever been. It's more diverse now than it's ever been. And so many communities and voices are coming to the table to work collaboratively, which before wasn't really happening except for in like little small pockets, like our example, where we were working collaboratively, but I think now it's growing beyond just Los Angeles and Southern California.
and we really, through the Pimo Catalina Island Archaeology Projects, we've been able to train not just students that are going to go into archaeology, but also we have a native practitioners one, and being able to bring tribes in to help us with the training is a way for students to sort of bridge the gap, because I know one of the questions was about sort of how do we deal with sort of sensitive issues, and it's really not sensitive. I mean, like it's more like an ethical thing, like you wouldn't, how do you speak to someone, more than it is that you have to be delicate. It's just being respectful, and being able to sort of show that to the students firsthand and have them already engaging with the Tongva community with our projects makes a big difference. And them being able to then go forward, and a lot of them have gone into working for tribes or working for federal agencies, and being able to take those examples forward.
Yeah. I mean, and to answer some of these other questions, will any of these collections be returned to the tribes that still exist? Yes. We are actively receiving requests all of the time to return materials to tribal communities. Our process, as Wendy mentioned, we're a little less further along than UCLA, but we have a really good dedicated staff, a great repatriation team who's committed to the return of ancestors and funerary objects. And we have several collaborative projects in progress to make that happen. How do archaeologists?
And while you're doing that, so we're all but done with sort of returning ancestors at UCLA. Repatriation is an ongoing interrogation. So we're working actively with the Australian Aboriginal communities and Torres Straits Islanders in order to sort of interrogate, again, some of the collections. And as well as we received the Mellon funding for interrogating Sir Henry Welcome's donation, which is a foundation of the museum, as well as it is for the British Museum. And so with the Benin bronzes and sort of looking at how did we end up with a lot of those African collections. And so that interrogation is something that I think all museums are now having to confront. And so this is the time. NAGPRA, I think in many ways, kind of eased the rails and made it less confrontational or less scary for museums to feel like they can open the doors, have people come in and say like, yeah, we like what you're doing, but these things have to go home. Yes. These things need to be cared for this way. I mean, that's really good. That's ultimately what we want.
Yes. It's an ever evolving process. I mean, each community is different. Not everyone wants the same objective. So, and we're in the process of learning more about our collection so we can inform those communities better on which way they want to proceed. And, the knowledge helps them decide that. How can we support archaeology stewardship at the Autry? There are a variety of ways. We are constantly in need of students, in need of internships, in need of fellowships. Granted projects is often what curators like Wendy and myself are we look for to support and bring in students to train. So there can be more future curators of archaeology. What is the Resource Center? My mistake. The Autry Resource Center is our brand new state-of-the-art facility that's housing all of the Autry's collections. So not just the Southwest Museum collection, but the greater Autry Western collection. And it will be a place to engage researchers and tribal communities. It has better space, better room, better facilities, so you can get a little bit closer to understanding and learning more about the object. Oh, what's also nice is that finally the archives are under the same roof as the collections. And in my case, the collections are directly tied, and it's been kind of unfortunate that they've been separated for so long, but now I have a great working relationship with my colleagues at the archives, and we're constantly pulling reports or old notes to kind of tie the collection back together. So all of that is happening in real time at the Resources Center.
Maggie O'Rourke mentioned, asked something about, the disposition of artifacts never documented. And it's to say that records are spotty. So in that case, we were missing a big chunk, which was what happened to those collections. And that's where we're trying to fill in the gaps. And you find field notes and documents sometimes in people's graduate students that never turn their stuff in. I have chased on people in Canada and England and said, hey, I know you're a retired professor, but can I have your field notes from your dissertation? And they're happy to give them. Some have been in closets underneath the Christmas ornaments, all of the bone materials that never got returned. So it's a lot of chasing people down, and some won't do my phone calls now because I'm always like, hey, can I get into your closet or your garage? We really like to alleviate you of those materials. So, people just, really a lot of it is they take their work seriously, and they may not have written up the report, and they think that one day they will. Yeah. And we're trying to get them in so that new students can look at them.
There's a question about stakeholders, and I would just kind of briefly say that I think every single stakeholder has a part to play. And whether it's the developer who has the new apartment idea, or the museum, or the student, I think if everyone kind of comes to the table and express their needs, then we can all find what works best for all of us. But what we've learned over the years is that communication is key to all of the stakeholders involved. And sometimes ideas don't align, but there is a solution if everyone's willing to come to the table and kind of work on it. And that kind of ties into the next question. It is hard work. And what are we hopeful for? That we have people who come behind us and continue the work and just don't stop. Wendy is 20 years in and has seen like the fruits of her labor return all the way home. I'm halfway in, hoping for that same type of return of the collections. And I'd like to see more students kind of make use of the collections. I'd like to see more tribes come in and learn and see their grandmother's basket, or see artifacts that they haven't seen in person and only seen in books, but they talk about it, they teach with it, and they want to get closer and get more engaged. There's so much potential. We could talk for hours, but I will end by saying that this is just the beginning of trying to give various stakeholders and interested volunteers and students and guests and visitors kind of a window into museum archaeology collections. My next speaker in the series is actually someone Wendy already mentioned, Cindy Autry, and we'll get an even closer look at some of the Tongva objects that she wishes to share and talk about, and what that means to her community, and she herself has researched a lot of our collection way before I even worked at the Autry, and she has an interesting and great perspective on what that institutional work means to her community directly. And then coming up tomorrow, I believe my colleague Lisa Posas has a great Salon talk as well on her work with the archives and an unidentified photograph. So stay tuned, continue to support us. There are lots of philanthropic ways to support our efforts with either the archaeology collections, the Greater Southwest Museum, or the Greater Autry collections, or the Autry Resource Center, where everything is housed and we all work together. And we're really excited. We continue to talk at conferences, and both nationally and within California. We want to continue that work. We want to continue to teach everyone about these collections and what it takes to bring so many stakeholders and communities together. So thank you.
Thank
We're out of
you.
time if there's any other. Oh, thank
And I should give a plug to our American Indian Studies Center.
Yes.
And so anyone who wants to support, I'm very happy that I get to teach there and get to have students become museum experts and go back home and take that knowledge with them. So, so look at what AIS at UCLA is doing, and that's always something good too.
Great.